The wind scoured the yard, lifting dust into the pale light like a slow, reluctant fire. Boards creaked under the weight of bodies, the auction platform leaning into its own age. Somewhere behind the noise of shuffling boots, a rope strained against a restless horse, its breath clouding in the cold air. The sun sat white and sharp above the rooftops, giving no warmth, only glare. Beneath it all, the air smelled of old pine, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. She kept her gaze on the grain of the boards under her feet. Each line of wood was worn smooth where countless heels had stood before, waiting to be measured, judged, taken. The ache low in her belly flared when she shifted her weight, though she didn't move much. Movement drew eyes. The cloth of her skirt pressed damp against her skin. She could taste salt on her upper lip, though the morning was cold. The voices carried easily over the sparse crowd. Men in dust-stiff hats and women in shawls spoke without lowering their tones. 2 days ago, they say. Still bleeding. And for what? A girl child. The last words were spat like something bitter. She didn't lift her head. Better they speak to each other than to her. Her wrists were loosely tied, the rope more for show than restraint. The man who had tied it, her late husband's brother, stood to her left, his hands clasped behind his back. He had the same narrow eyes as his mother, who waited at the edge of the platform, lips pressed thin enough to whiten. The pair of them leaned toward a man in a brown coat, speaking low, gesturing toward her. The brown coat's gaze ran over her the way a buyer looks at the teeth of a horse. She had thought there would be more people. Somehow that was worse, that this humiliation wasn't even worth a crowd. A man coughed, and somewhere in the back a child laughed, shrill and short before being hushed. The auctioneer, a thick-bodied man with cheeks like baked apples, cleared his throat. His eyes passed over her without lingering. Widow. 1 infant. 2 days born. His voice was matter-of-fact, almost bored. Fit enough, though weak from the birthing. Family no longer able to house her. Opening at. She's a mouth, not a hand, her mother-in-law interrupted. You'll not get coin unless you sell them separate. The words were cleanly cut, meant to slice. A murmur went through the onlookers. Selling them separate meant the child one way, the mother another. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling her pulse in her teeth. She had promised herself she wouldn't beg here. Begging had no place under the eyes of these people. But the sound of her daughter's small breath from the wicker basket at her feet almost unseated her resolve. The auctioneer raised a hand to still the talk, though his own expression seemed ready to agree. You want them separate, you take that up after the bidding, he said. Opening. The first snap of leather broke his words. She flinched at the sound before the pain bloomed across her shoulder, hot and sudden. She stumbled half a step, rope tugging her wrists. It wasn't a beating, not yet, just the reminder of her place. Her brother-in-law's voice came low behind her. Stand straight. Another crack followed, grazing this time, more sound than sting. The crowd had gone quieter. She straightened, jaw tight, eyes on the ground. The baby stirred, a thin cry cutting through the air. She bent as much as the rope allowed, touching the edge of the basket with her fingertips, letting the baby feel her presence. The crying eased, but the sound had drawn attention. Not worth feeding, someone said. Couldn't give him a son, said another. The auctioneer tried again. Opening. I'll take them both. The words cut through, low but clear, from somewhere beyond the first row of onlookers. She felt the silence swell around it, eyes turning. Slowly she lifted her head. He stood near the hitching rail, tall, the brim of his hat shadowing most of his face. His coat was worn at the edges, dust lying soft along his shoulders, but his boots, though scratched, had been cleaned. He had no weapon in his hands, only a small, folded piece of paper. He did not look at her long. His gaze moved briefly to the baby, then to the auctioneer. Her brother-in-law's head came up sharply. She's not yours too. I'll take them both, the man repeated, same tone, same measured volume. Not demanding, not pleading. A simple fact. The crowd began to hum with talk. Bought himself trouble. What's he want with a woman so fresh from the bed? Maybe just the child. Her mother-in-law spoke now, voice sharp as snapped bone. You'll not. Cash, he said, cutting across her. He stepped forward and laid the folded paper on the auction block. The auctioneer's fingers moved over it quickly, the sound of counting paper carrying in the quiet. A moment later the auctioneer nodded once, his expression unreadable. It's done, he said. Her brother-in-law started to protest, but the auctioneer turned away, calling for the next lot. The rope at her wrists was cut. The sudden slackness in her hands felt strange, almost dangerous. She rubbed at the red marks without thinking. The man in the hat had already stepped back, giving her space. No hand reached for her arm, no assumption of touch. He waited near the edge of the platform. She bent and lifted the basket. The movement made her stomach tighten, heat spreading low, but she kept her face still. The baby's eyes were closed, mouth moving in some small dream. She stepped down, careful, the boards creaking under her. The crowd did not part quickly. She could feel them watching, the weight of their judgment following her down each step. When she reached him, he looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were pale but not cold. He didn't speak. He simply turned toward the rail where a horse waited, reins tied loose. She followed without asking why. Behind them, the voices picked up again. She didn't listen to the words, only the cadence, the sound of a tide moving away. The rope that had bound her lay curled on the platform, forgotten. Above, a hawk wheeled in the high sky, its shadow sliding over her face as she walked. The wagon wheels turned with a steady, groaning rhythm, their creak folding into the sigh of wind over the plain. She sat on the rough bench, the wicker basket beside her, the blanket drawn close against the baby's cheek. The man guided the team without hurry, reins loose but certain in his hands. Dust rose in thin veils behind them, catching light before falling back to earth. The town receded until it was no more than a jagged line against the horizon. She kept her eyes ahead, where the land stretched unbroken, a flat sweep of pale grass and dark scrub. Here and there, stones jutted like old teeth from the ground. The air smelled faintly of sage and something mineral, like rain that had never arrived. For a while, there was no sound but the horses and the shift of the wooden frame. She measured her breaths, careful to keep them even, and glanced sideways at the man. His profile was clean-edged, the skin at his jaw roughened by stubble. The hat shadowed his eyes, though now and then a shaft of light caught the pale color beneath. His coat, frayed along one cuff, shifted when he moved, showing the glint of a plain buckle. Nothing about him was hurried. He neither searched for words nor seemed troubled by their absence. When he finally spoke, it was not a question. "There's water in the skin behind you." She turned, found the leather shape, still cool from the morning. She drank sparingly, the taste of river and leather filling her mouth, then passed it back. He nodded once, took a single swallow and hooked it by the bench. No comment followed. She found she preferred that. The baby made a soft, restless noise. She touched the small bundle, palm curved over the crown of her daughter's head. The movement was automatic, anchored in habit. Still, she felt his gaze rest briefly on her hand before returning to the road. The hours stretched. Shadows shifted, the sun climbing higher until it pressed heat down onto the wagon boards. He guided the team to a low rise where a thin cottonwood stood, its leaves whispering. The horses halted with a jolt that made the basket sway. She steadied it quickly. He climbed down, tied the reins to a root, and stepped aside so she could descend without his help. Her legs ached from stillness, the jolt of motion sending a dull throb through her belly. "Rest here," he said. His voice was quiet, carrying no command, only shape. She sat on the low edge of the wagon, letting her boots touch the grass. He unwrapped a cloth from his saddlebag, laying out half a loaf of bread and a small wedge of cheese. She hesitated, unsure if it was meant for her, but he set both near the basket and walked to the streambed beyond the tree. The distance he left between them was deliberate. She felt its intention. The bread was coarse but fresh enough, the cheese sharp. She ate slowly, more for the steadying effect than for hunger. The baby stirred, eyes still closed, mouth seeking. She shifted her shawl, cradled the small body, and let her feed. A breeze lifted the hair at her temple, carrying the faint sound of water trickling over stone. When he returned, he had refilled the water skin and washed his hands. He didn't glance at the baby, only set the skin beside her. "We'll keep on until we lose the light," he said. "My place is another day past that." She nodded. The thought of where his place might be was still too large to consider. She was moving toward something she could not picture. That was better than staying where she had been. Back on the bench, she noticed the horizon darken in the east. A low line of cloud, its edges blurred, moved slow but certain. The wind shifted, cooler now. He adjusted the reins and the wagon picked up pace. They spoke little. Once she asked his name. "Calder," he said, and left it there. He didn't ask hers in return. That omission eased something in her, though she couldn't have said why. Near mid-afternoon they stopped at a way station, 2 squat buildings of stone and timber, a corral behind. The smell of manure was sharp in the air. A man emerged from the main building, wiping his hands on a rag, eyes sliding from Calder to her. He said nothing, only nodded toward the trough. Calder watered the horses himself. Inside, she followed quietly, keeping the basket close. The room smelled of tobacco and boiled coffee. 3 men at a corner table glanced up, then bent their heads together, voices low. "Bought himself trouble," she heard. "Won't last through winter." The words were like the bite of cold metal, familiar in their form, unwelcome in their truth. She kept her face still and walked past. Calder took 2 mugs of coffee from the counter, set one near her on the shelf that passed for a table. They drank standing, neither commenting on the taste. When he was done, he left coins on the counter without counting them. They were outside again before the shadows lengthened. The land changed as they went, scrub giving way to open stretches of short grass, then to broken ground where stone showed through. She noticed the hawk again, riding the air far to the left, its shadow occasionally flashing across the ground. She wondered if it was the same bird from town or if all hawks seemed to watch with that same unblinking patience. Toward evening, they found a hollow between 2 low ridges, sheltered from the wind. Calder unhitched the team, rubbed them down, and set a small fire with dry brush. She sat near the flames, the baby swaddled in her shawl. The orange light caught the lines of his hands as he worked, each movement deliberate. He didn't speak unless there was need. More wood there, or fire'll hold for an hour. After they ate, a bit more bread, a handful of dried meat, he walked a short distance away, scanning the darkening ridge. When he returned, he placed a folded blanket near her. "Get some rest." She lay on her side, the baby close, the fire's warmth against her back. She could hear him moving quietly, adjusting the horse's lines, the scrape of metal against leather as he checked the tack. The night filled in around them, crickets, the low rustle of grass, the distant call of some unseen bird. Sleep came slow, but it came. At dawn, the air was cold enough to bite. The fire was only ash, but Calder had coffee heating by the time she sat up. She accepted the tin cup without a word, the heat seeping into her fingers. He had already packed most of the gear, the wagon ready. They were moving again before the sun cleared the ridge. The second day was quieter still. She began to notice the way he rode, the rhythm of the horses, his weight shifting subtly with the turns, the small adjustments of the reins. Once, when the baby coughed, he slowed the team without being asked. Later, when she shifted the basket closer to shield it from wind, he altered their path to take advantage of a low rise. By late afternoon, the clouds from the east had caught up to them. The wind carried the scent of wet earth, though the rain held back. Calder glanced upward once, then angled the team toward a darker line on the horizon. It proved to be a stand of trees, their branches bending under the push of the wind. There was a shallow shelter of rock at the edge, enough to keep them dry if the rain came. They stopped there, the horses restless. Calder secured them, then set a small fire low to the ground. The wind hissed through the branches overhead. She sat close, the baby tucked against her chest, listening to the sound of the horses shifting. He sat across from her, the firelight pulling the pale of his eyes into focus. "Tomorrow we'll be at the ranch," he said. She felt the word settle between them. Ranch. It could mean space or labor or something harder. She did not ask. The fire popped, sending a brief flare upward. His gaze stayed on the flames, but she thought, just for a moment, she saw the corner of his mouth shift as if some private thought had crossed it. The rain began lightly, a scatter of drops against the leaves. She drew the blanket tighter. He rose, checked the horses once more, then returned. The distance between them was smaller now, but not enough to touch. The fire's heat bridged the rest. When she lay down that night, she listened to the rain on leaves, to the slow, even breathing across the fire. The path ahead was still unknown, but the space beside her no longer felt like something to be braced against. Somewhere above the rain, far off, the hawk's cry carried on the wind. The land rose in shallow swells, the grass giving way to bare patches where rock broke the surface. By mid-morning, the horizon shifted to show a thin line of fence, posts weathered gray and set at even intervals. Calder slowed the team as they passed through a wide gate, the hinges groaning. Beyond lay a modest spread of buildings, a low barn with a slanting roof, a small house with walls of unpainted wood, and a shed leaning slightly away from the wind. No ornament, no sign of other lives, just the mark of work done to keep the place standing. He guided the wagon past the barn and pulled up near the house. She stepped down carefully, her legs stiff from days of travel, the baby's weight a steady anchor against her chest. The air smelled of dry grass and old timber. Calder untied the horses and led them toward the barn, his steps quiet on the packed dirt. Inside the house, the light was dim. The front room held a plain table, 2 chairs, and a stove whose iron sides radiated faint warmth. The shelves were bare except for a row of tin mugs and a single plate. She set the basket on the table, smoothing the blanket around the baby. The floorboards creaked when she moved, the sound swallowed quickly by the stillness. Calder returned with a bucket of water, setting it near the stove. "It's not much," he said, glancing around the room as if to confirm the truth of it. "But it's dry. Roof holds." She nodded, fingers resting lightly on the basket's rim. It was not comfort she sought, only steadiness. This place seemed to have that. They worked without plan that first day. He split wood behind the barn. She swept dust from the floor and wiped the table clean. The small motions of order steadied her more than she expected. That night they ate boiled potatoes and a thin stew. The baby slept in the basket near the stove. Calder sat opposite her, elbows on the table, gaze lowered. He asked nothing, offered nothing beyond what was necessary. She found herself grateful for it. The next morning he left early to check the fence line. Alone, she walked the edges of the yard, the sun catching on the low grass. There was a small garden patch, overgrown but not beyond repair. She pulled the worst of the weeds, feeling the earth loosen under her hands. The work warmed her, and by the time he returned, her skirts were marked with soil. He glanced at the patch, said only, "Ground's good there." It was the closest thing to approval she had heard from him. Days fell into rhythm. She mended a loose hinge on the barn door. He replaced a pane of glass in the small window over the table. They spoke little, but each act made space for the next. In the evenings, they sat by the stove while the baby slept, the quiet between them no longer edged with caution. It was on their second trip into town that the first cracks showed. The market was crowded, the air thick with the smell of smoked meat and horse. She kept close to the basket, her shawl drawn high. The murmur of voices followed her down each row. "Is that her?" one woman asked another, not bothering to lower her tone. "The one Calder brought in from the auction." "She looks thin," came the reply. "Too thin for the work out there." At the baker's stall, a man behind her muttered, "Bought himself trouble, that one." She did not turn. The words slid into the place where older wounds lay, pressing against them until they throbbed. When she handed over coin for bread, the baker's eyes lingered on her as if weighing what she might be worth. Calder returned from the far side of the market carrying a small sack of grain. His gaze flicked over her face, reading something she hadn't said. "Done here?" She nodded, and they left without pause. On the way back, the wagon was silent. The road unwound between them, the sound of the wheels steady. She kept her eyes on the horizon, the thin shape of the barn drawing closer with each turn. The words from town clung to her, heavy as damp cloth. The following week, she began to hear other whispers, this time in the form of news carried by Calder. "Your in-laws were in town," he said one evening as he set a sack of feed by the wall. "Asking questions. Saying the baby's theirs by right." She kept her hands still on the table's edge. The baby slept in the basket nearby, her breath light and steady. "They'll try to take her," she said, not a question. "They'll try," he agreed. No false comfort. No promise he couldn't keep. His eyes met hers for a long moment before he turned to tend the stove. After that, she was more aware of the edges of the land, the places where a wagon might come into view. She checked the latch on the barn twice each night, though she told herself it was only habit. Calder worked longer hours, mending fence in the far field, the sound of hammering carrying faintly on the wind. One afternoon, as she hung laundry on the line, she saw the hawk again, perched on a fence post beyond the garden. Its head turned, watching. The sight made something tighten in her chest. She held its gaze for a moment before it lifted away, wings cutting the sky. The next time they went to town, the air felt charged. People's eyes followed them with open curiosity. At the general store, the shopkeeper leaned forward over the counter. "Your people were here again," he said to her, voice pitched just low enough to force her to listen. "Made a loud case for how you were stolen." She set the tin of lamp oil on the counter, her grip firm. "I'm not theirs," she said, surprising herself with the clarity of her voice. The shopkeeper's brows rose, but he said nothing more. Calder paid, his hand steady on the coins. As they left, she caught sight of her mother-in-law across the street, the older woman's face a hard mask. Their eyes met only briefly before the crowd closed between them. The baby shifted in the basket and she drew the shawl tighter. That night, the wind picked up. Calder stood in the doorway looking out across the yard. "They'll push harder," he said without turning. She joined him, the cold air brushing her face. The stars were sharp above the dark land. "Then we'll push back," she said. His glance was brief but certain, as if he'd been waiting for her to speak those words. He stepped aside so she could pass, the gesture small but deliberate. In the days that followed, the threat felt closer. A rider passed along the far fence one morning, not stopping but not hurrying either. She noticed the way Calder's shoulders set when he came in from the field that evening, his hands lingering on the latch of the barn door. Still they worked. She planted the first row of beans in the garden. He fixed the sag in the porch step. The life they were building held, even under the weight pressing in from beyond the fences. One late afternoon, as the light thinned, she heard hoofbeats on the road. She stepped onto the porch, heart lifting into her throat. Two figures approached, her brother-in-law in front, another man behind. Calder stepped from the barn, his eyes narrowing. The riders slowed but did not stop at the gate. Her brother-in-law called out, voice sharp. "We'll be back for what's ours." The words hung in the cooling air. Calder didn't answer. The horses turned, their hoofbeats fading toward town. She stood still until the sound was gone. When she looked at Calder, his gaze was already on her. No question, no command. Only a quiet readiness. The baby's cry came from inside, thin but strong. She turned toward the sound, the door closing behind her, the weight of the coming choice settling into the walls. The morning began without wind. The stillness lay heavy over the yard, as if the air itself were waiting. She stood at the edge of the porch, the baby against her shoulder, watching the pale wash of light spread across the field. Calder moved near the barn, checking the latch as he always did, though his hands lingered longer this time. The sound of his boots on packed dirt was steady, unhurried, but each movement carried weight. By midday the sky had dulled, clouds pulling across the sun. She was inside, mending a tear in the baby's blanket, when the hoofbeats came. Not the distant kind that pass along the far fence, but the closer rhythm of riders taking the main road toward the house. She set down the blanket and moved to the door. Three figures came into view. Her brother-in-law rode in front, posture straight, jaw set. Behind him, her mother-in-law sat upright on a smaller horse, her mouth tight with purpose. A third man she didn't know followed, his eyes shifting over the yard. They slowed as they reached the gate, then dismounted, tying their reins loosely. The baby stirred at her shoulder, sensing the change in her breath. Calder stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't move toward them, but stood where he was, the barn's shadow falling across him. His face held no surprise. He looked at her once, briefly, as if to ask without words if she was ready. Her brother-in-law spoke first. "We're here for the child," he said, voice clipped. "She's blood. She belongs with her kin." She stepped down from the porch, each board under her foot sounding loud in the quiet. The air smelled of dust and horse. "She belongs with her mother," she said, her voice even. Her mother-in-law's gaze was sharp, cold. "A mother who can't feed herself won't keep a child alive. We'll see her cared for. You'll see her shaped into what you think a woman should be," she said, feeling her pulse in her fingertips. "And I know too well what that is." The older woman's mouth tightened. "You're nothing without us." She felt Calder's presence behind her, not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could sense his stillness. It was not a shield, it was space he was giving her, to stand or to falter by her own choice. Her brother-in-law took a step closer. "We can make this legal. You think he," a glance toward Calder, "can keep you safe from that?" The baby shifted, a small sound escaping her. She felt the weight of the tiny body against her chest, the fragile warmth. For years she had been spoken for, spoken over, her own voice folded small inside her. She saw the road behind her, auction boards underfoot, dust in her mouth, the hawk's shadow passing over her, and the road ahead empty but her own. "She's mine," she said, the words ringing sharper than she expected. "This home is mine. And this man is mine by my choosing." The silence after was wide. The wind, which had been holding back all morning, stirred through the grass. Her mother-in-law's eyes flickered, the faintest crack in the hardness. Her brother-in-law's jaw shifted, but he didn't step forward again. The man she didn't know looked away as if there were nothing here worth the trouble. Calder hadn't moved. His gaze stayed on the three riders, his shoulders loose but ready. When he spoke, it was almost quiet. "You've had your say. Now you'll leave." Her brother-in-law's lips thinned. He turned without answering, swinging into the saddle. The others followed. The horses' hooves struck dull against the dirt as they rode back the way they'd come. No parting words, no promises. Just distance growing with each stride. She stood where she was until the sound faded. The baby had gone still again, her small face pressed into the curve of her neck. When she turned toward the porch, Calder was already moving to meet her. He didn't reach for her or the child. Instead, he stepped aside so she could pass through the doorway before him, the gesture wordless but full. Inside, the stove's low heat welcomed them. She laid the baby in the basket near the table and stood for a moment, letting her hands rest on the rim. Her breathing slowed, the tightness in her chest loosening by degrees. Calder set his hat on the table, its brim marked with the wear of years. "You spoke for yourself," he said, not as praise but as fact. "I did," she said. The words felt steady now, anchored. That afternoon they worked as they always did. He mending a gate, she tending the garden, but something in the air between them had shifted. Not lighter, exactly, but cleaner, as if the wind had cleared out the dust. In the evening they sat by the stove. The baby slept in her basket, the fire's light soft on her cheek. Outside, the last of the daylight bled over the field. She stepped to the door, looking out. The sky held the faint shape of a hawk wheeling high above the horizon, its path easy, unhurried. For the first time, she didn't feel as though it was circling her. It was simply moving on. When she turned back, Calder was at the table, hands resting loosely on the wood. He met her gaze without searching it, as if he already knew what he would find there. On the stove, the kettle began to hum, a low sound that filled the quiet. She crossed the room and sat opposite him. There was no need for thanks. He had not given her her voice, only made space for it to rise. He poured the coffee, sliding the tin mug toward her. The warmth in her hands was real, grounding. Later, when the fire had burned low, he stood and held out the reins of the plow horse. The leather was warm from his grip. "You should take her tomorrow," he said. "The ground's ready." She closed her fingers around the reins. The gesture was more than work. It was a place in the shaping of this land in the days ahead. She nodded, not because she needed his permission, but because the act deserved acknowledgement. The next morning the air smelled faintly of rain. She led the horse to the field, the earth dark and waiting. Calder worked nearby, setting posts along the fence line. The baby's small cry came from the porch, a bright sound against the sweep of the wind. She felt it settle into her bones, that this was not safety given but life chosen. When she drove the plow into the soil, the leather steady in her hands, the first furrow opened dark and rich. The hawk passed once overhead, its shadow gliding over the ground, and then was gone.